Welcome back to my channel. I love to talk about Celtic mythology, but the problem with Celtic mythology is it's very complex, and one or the other character appear and reappear in one or the other story, but they are too complex than to explain them every time I mention them. So you heard me mention entities like the Tuatha Dé Danann or the Fomorians, and I'm not really explaining them in every video. So before I now go on talking about Celtic mythology, I thought I'd make a video to give you an impression of who the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Fomorians really are and what role they play in the bigger picture. So let's talk about the Fomorians and the Tuatha Dé Danann. So in this episode, I'll attempt to explain to you who the Tuatha Dé Danann and their foes, the Fomorians, really were. And by no means I'm definitely no expert in Irish mythology. I'm just deeply fascinated by it, and I basically read everything about it, what I could get my hands on since the pandemic began and even before that. The problem with Irish mythology is that the Druids passed down their knowledge orally and never wrote anything down. So all we know about it is basically what was handed down over generations, later came to the ears of the Christian monks, and what they ultimately wrote down, with or without Christian influences. And so many details were lost, and even those legends who survived may have several versions, which sometimes even contradict each other, and other times just have huge knowledge gaps within them. But I'll try my best to summarize all the different versions I found to give you an impression of who those gods and demigods and even demons of Celtic mythology really were. Let's start with the Fomorians. The Fomorians are also known under the name Fomori, and they are the traditional rivals or foes of the Tuatha Dé Danann. They were said to have been in Ireland long before the Tuatha Dé Danann first set foot on Ireland. Their name means something like the Undergiants, or those who live under the sea, and they are often depicted as dark, demonic and hideous creatures. But they don't seem to have many common traits as a race. Different characters of the Fomorians were depicted completely differently, from really tiny to really huge creatures, often with magical abilities. But other Fomorians seem to look nearly human-like, so it's hard to find any images of them, since nobody really knows how they might have looked like. Sometimes they are said to have lived under the surface of the earth, but even though they are called Undergiants, they really just seem to be another kind of demigods, just like the Tuatha Dé Danann. They must have had similar characteristics, since there are multiple incidents of children between those races. I will talk about specific Fomorians, like Balor of the Evil Eye, in later videos. But for now, let's take a look at their foes. Let's take a look at the Tuatha Dé Danann. The Tuatha Dé Danann are basically the deities of the mythology of Ireland, Scotland and the Isle of Monks. Their name means something like the people of the goddess Danu, even though in earlier versions they were also just known as the Tuatha Dé, the people of the gods or goddesses. But why the people of the goddess Danu? Well, to explain that I have to go a little bit further back in time. It is said that Ireland was invaded several times, but often the invaders died in mysterious circumstances, or were expelled by the Fomorians. I'll tell you the whole story of the invasions of Ireland in a future video. But for now, just accept there was a longer story behind that what I'm trying to tell you now. However, there was one group of invaders who fought the Fomorians, and in that story the Fomorians actually seem to have been the natives of Ireland, or at least some kind of pirates who also invaded Ireland. However, the people who fought the Fomorians ultimately lost and had to flee. One group of them fled into the north. They were greeted by the goddess Danu and lived in 4 magical cities created by her. Those cities were Phalias, Murias, Gorias and Phineas. In each city there lived a druid, and these druids taught the people who step by step became the Tuatha Dé Danann. There they learned the craft of sorcery, druidry, and sacred knowledge. And through that process of learning, they became more than mere humans, if they ever were that. They became some kind of demigod race. At least that's the impression you get from reading these stories. So basically, the Tuatha De Danann are the people of the goddess Danu because they lived in the sacred cities of Danu and were transformed by what they experienced there. But at some point, they came back to Ireland and became the 5th people to invade Ireland. They came back in ships, but not sailing the sea, but sailing in a black cloud or mist which darkened the sun for 3 whole days. They were led by their king Nuada and arrived in Ireland around the time of today's Beltane festival, which, by the way, is the 13th of April, so basically today. Nuada made them burn their ships, so that they would force themselves to settle in Ireland and to not look back. And at this point, the question in my mind would be, why wouldn't they want to look back, and why did they leave in the first place? But at least until this point in time, I haven't found an answer to that. So let's go on. Anyway, during the 3 days of darkness, everything seemed fine. But when the mists faded, the Tuatha De Danann were noticed by those who already lived in Ireland, the Fir Bolg. The Fir Bolg were descendants of the same people as the Tuatha De Danann were, those who fought the Fomorians earlier. But their tribe came back way earlier than the Tuatha De Danann and fought the Fomori for the right of this land. The Tuatha De Danann, however, were determined to stay in Ireland and to get their share of the land, and so they demanded half of the whole island. They gave the Fir Bolg choice to either give them what they desired or to go into battle, and the Fir Bolg chose battle. The first battle raged for around 4 days, and during this battle, the king of the Tuatha De Danann, Nuada, lost one of his arms. But in the end, the Tuatha De Danann won, and the Fir Bolg accepted a single province as their land. The problem at this point was that Nuada had lost his arm, and therefore wasn't flawless anymore. But to be king of the Tuatha De Danann, he had to be flawless. So in the end, he resigned, and Bres the Beautiful was pronounced the new king of the Tuatha De Danann. Bres, however, was just half Tuatha De Danann. His mother was one of the Tuatha De Danann, whilst his father was a king of the Fomorians. His parents married to secure peace between both races. And at this point, a side note, I'm not quite sure when this peace treaty was started, since from my understanding at this point the Tuatha De Danann weren't in Ireland for a long time, but Bres already was an adult. But it's mythology, and even worse, it's Irish mythology, so I just take that as a given. However, Bres was more loyal to the Fomorians than to the Tuatha De Danann, and during 7 years increasingly started to enslave the Tuatha De Danann and to become more and more of a tyrant. Meanwhile, Nuada managed to first get an arm of silver, which gave him the nickname Nuada of the Silver Arm, and this arm eventually turned into an arm of flesh again. And after 7 years, he exiled Bres and became king himself again. You can imagine Bres wasn't really happy about that. So he ran to his other family, the Fomorians. He ran to the king of the Fomorians, Balor of the Evil Eye. And the king gathered his armies and started a war between the Fomorians and the Tuatha De Danann. This time, Nuada died during the battle by the hand of Balor, but he was avenged by the heroic warrior Lugh, who, by the way, was the grandson of Balor, but that's a topic for another video. In the end, the Fomorians were defeated and Lugh became king, and a time of peace started for the Tuatha De Danann. But of course, all good things must come to an end, and at some point, the last wave of invaders came to Ireland, called the Milesians, basically the Celts who are considered to be the ancestors of today's Irish people. The Tuatha De Danann greeted the intruders peacefully, but from this point on, there are various versions of how the story went on. In one version, both people couldn't find an agreement, and the Tuatha De Danann tricked the Milesians into a boat and then cast a storm to get them away from the island. But either one of the druids cast a spell to tame the weather, or the goddess Era, which later gave the island her name, heard the prayers of the Melicians and let them come back to the island. Either way, from this point on, they saw the island as their own and never left again. Another version says that the goddess Danu herself called the Tuatha Dé Danann to the land of Tir na Nog, the land of eternal youth, to live peacefully and in prosperity. And the third version says that in the end a truce between the Melicians and the Tuatha Dé Danann was reached, and the Melicians got the land above, basically Ireland, while the Tuatha Dé Danann followed the call of the goddess and took the land below, also known as the Otherworld. Which version is true? Well, who can say that? Maybe a little bit of every version is true. Either way, the Tuatha Dé Danann became known as the Sidhe, the fairies, or the people of the hills, where they are said to live until this day. So now you should have a rough idea of who the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Fomori are. If you enjoyed this video, and if you want to know more about some special Tuatha Dé Danann, click on my other videos. See you next time. Bye!